Welcome. My name is Laura Jenkins. I'm the AAA Play Manager. And AAA Play, for those of you that don't know, is a program, a service that is funded by Sport and Recreation Victoria to help connect people with disability to sport and recreation opportunities. So today's community practice is hosted by us, but delivered by Sport and Recreation Victoria as part of their community practice series. I'd just like to start, please, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Also like to just apologise. We were hoping to have an Auslan interpreter today, however unfortunately there's no one available, so we haven't been able to provide that for you today. And I'm told that the bathrooms are downstairs if anyone's needing it, so go down to the elevators, left and left is apparently where you go to find those bathrooms. So that's the housekeeping out of the way. So we might get started. I'd like to get you to give a warm welcome and big introduction to our very first speaker, Sarah Sterling. She's the Sector Development Management Manager for Volunteering Victoria, to talk to us about best practice of a volunteer group.
Hi everyone, and thank you for having me. And look, Laura in some ways has given me a very impossible task to talk about best practice for managing volunteers in about 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to do my best to pack a lot in. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians where we are, Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So, in terms of what I'm going to try and cover today in my jam-packed, fully loaded 20 minutes, is tell you a little bit about who we are as Volunteering Victoria. Have a look at a definition of volunteering from Volunteering Australia, look at the national standards for volunteer involvement, understand a little bit about the impact of COVID-19, and I'm sure many of you in this room will have really experienced that at a first-hand level about how that's influenced sport and volunteering. Looking at kind of effective recruitment in general, and then kind of tips for recovering well, and I guess some of the impact that the sporting sector has had. So, who we are as Volunteering Victoria, we are the state peak body for volunteering, and we focus on advocacy, sector development and promotion of volunteering. And we're, I think, a bit of a unique peak body because we unite a whole bunch of sectors. We unite and represent volunteers and volunteer-involving organisations from sport, from emergency services, from community services, religion, education, a whole bunch of sectors. And so we represent a really diverse amount of Victorians, but probably, I'm biased here, but I think we represent, a huge amount of Victorians and a huge amount of the industry and the impact for Victorian communities. It's an oddity, I think, that despite sport and recreation having about the most volunteers reported on the ABS, the statistics that we get through the ABS, we have the lowest membership of peak bodies. So whenever I come out talking in front of sport and rec audiences, I always try and make sure I talk about who we are, because I think we're not as well known necessarily in sporting circles. Now, it may seem a little bit common sense to have a definition of volunteering, but a lot of the infrastructure and standards that we have in the volunteering sector are based on this particular definition. And apologies for going on some nuts and bolts, but in Australia, our endorsed definition is volunteering is time willingly given for the common good and without financial gain. And I think that hopefully illustrates things a little bit well in terms of what volunteering looks like. It doesn't actually have to happen at a not-for-profit necessarily, and there are all sorts of different corporations that are coming up now in terms of big corps and social enterprises and how that fits in. But the main thing is that it's time willingly given for the common good, and there's a whole bunch of resources around the definition of what we consider volunteering here in Australia. If we had a bit more time, I'd ask you to pick out what words stand out to you about that definition. So if you want some homework, go away and think about, are there any words that stand out to you? And reflect on what that might be and how that might impact how we view volunteering. So just a little bit about the infrastructure we have to support volunteering. So I'm going to talk about best practice, and I'm going to go into actually methods of best practice in a little bit, but we have national standards for volunteer involvement. And so they were first developed in 1996, but the recent standards were released in 2015, and they're available for free via Volunteering Australia's website. And they give a really comprehensive overview of the 8 standards for effective volunteer involvement. So leadership and management, apologies, the numbers slipped off that slide. Commitment to volunteer involvement, volunteer roles, recruitment and selection, support and development, workplace safety and wellbeing, volunteer recognition, quality management and continuous improvement. And so ensuring a really quality volunteer experience encompasses work at all of those levels. And please, by the way, if anyone has any questions as I'm going, feel free to stick your hand up. We're a small enough group that I'm very happy to take questions as I go. Now, that's our best and biggest piece of infrastructure here, and a lot of the training support that are delivered through volunteering peak bodies, or a lot of the way we're hoping that volunteer involving organisations will base their policies is based on these particular national standards. But how do we know what volunteering actually looks like in the state? So Volunteering Victoria actually undertook a State of Volunteering report last year, and it was interestingly timed because, of course, we were starting to undertake this project right at the start of COVID. So we got some pretty interesting data on what volunteering looks like in Victoria in a general year, but also some of the early impact of COVID, and some of that obviously pertains to the sport and rec sector. So what it looks like in Victoria is that approximately 2.3 million people volunteer, or 42.1% of Victorians, and Victorians on average give about 223.9 hours a year, or 4.5 hours a week. And I always encourage people when they're looking at this state volunteering data to think about how that relates to their organisation or their experience. And when I consider volunteering in a sports club, about 4 hours a week may be right if you're showing up on a Sunday or to coach. Might be a little longer than that. Maybe if you're on the board, you can say I do volunteering every single day of the week. But I always like to think back about how that data relates to the specific sector. We also ask people what the barriers to volunteering were. And again, I urge you to go back and have a look at this report, because unfortunately I can't give a full comprehensive overview in 20 minutes. But often what was unique about this report is we spoke to volunteers and non-volunteers and asked them about their barriers and motivations for volunteering. And I think when we reflect on some of the barriers to volunteering, we can start to, remove some of the challenges for people who want to volunteer. So top 3 barriers for non-volunteers were limited time work commitments. I had never been asked. And for volunteers, it was limited time work commitments and family commitments. And that never been asked is a really interesting one, because I think a lot of people who have been involved for a long time with the sporting club would go, are you kidding me? We ask everyone all the time. But there's evidently a little bit of a percentage that doesn't feel they've been asked, or doesn't feel they've been asked in the right way. So that's a really interesting one to think about, how we advertise our volunteer roles, ask people to get involved. And then the top 3 motivations that we had for Victorians to volunteer were to give to a community, support a cause, and for social connection. So again, thinking about what those motivations are is really, really important. But in terms of what about COVID, and obviously we're not in a post-COVID world. Today, obviously we've had some announcements that mean we're constantly in this evolving state of things, but we had a dramatic decrease in volunteering, and I'm sure that's of no surprise to you guys in the sector. You would have had clubs that just packed up and weren't able to operate, and so volunteers, of course, were not giving their volunteer hours while, play was unable to continue going. That drop, or decrease in formal volunteering, was a decline of about 64% in terms of overall volunteer hours. So it's really safe to say that the impact that COVID-19 has had on volunteering in the state across all sectors has been pretty much unprecedented. In terms of what we know about the ongoing impact of COVID-19, Volunteering Australia recently did some research, and about 3/4 of respondents reported that their volunteer programs were only partially operational or not operational, and smaller organisations were more likely not to have reopened their volunteer programs. So we really are seeing a slow, regeneration in the volunteering sector, and so really important for you to know how you can support clubs that you work with, organisations that you work with to regenerate their volunteers. And again, I imagine some of this may resonate with your personal experience. Again, the confidence of organisations for achieving pre-COVID levels in the next 6 months, it was about 50-50 in terms of confident or not confident. And a lot of that has to do with the ongoing challenges around managing a COVID-safe plan, managing QR codes, a lot of the logistics, as well as recruiting and bringing in new volunteers to replace some that may have reevaluated their volunteering time and experience during COVID. A few more statistics, and then I promise I'm going to get onto the practical tips soon. So again, looking at that ongoing impact, we had 56% of organisations said they needed more volunteers. So if you're feeling like, oh my God, we're desperate for volunteers in the sport and rec sector, you are not alone. 43% of organisations were experiencing an increase in demand for services. Now that may be, less of a challenge in the sport and rec sector as opposed to the kind of food relief sector, but worth noting that there is an increased demand for services. 30% of organisations were sort of seeing volunteering more as a pathway to employment. 25% of organisations were engaging more volunteers kind of remotely or virtually. And that's something that could be a whole other talk, but I'd encourage you guys to think flexibly about how you can involve volunteers. And it may be that certain coaching roles at clubs are unable to happen virtually, but there is great opportunities to assist with social media, to assist with potentially board volunteering to occur virtually, and that is the trend and the way things are going. So what can be done? And what can be done in 10 minutes is really more the key. But I think really having a winning recruitment strategy and having the right messaging around volunteering is key, and particularly around engaging diverse groups of volunteers. And a lot of people are saying, how do we engage these volunteers? That might be less of a challenge in the sport and rec sector because you've got a really natural group of younger volunteers to talk to. But targeting your message around volunteering and not just saying, hey, help out, is a real important thing. For example, I was talking to some football clubs years ago, and we realised they had said, hey, Sarah, come talk to us about recruitment. We're really concerned we're having real trouble. And they realised, hang on a second, we're not recruiting for specific positions. We're just saying, come in, help out. But actually, I'm not someone who signs up for something unless I know what's involved. So as a volunteer, the more information you can give prospective volunteers through your communication, volunteer advertising is better. Be prepared to try things differently, and also remember that communication is really key. And again, I'm just going to show you something to kind of highlight my advertising point, and we can talk about different advertising portals, and I haven't really gone into that depth, but I'm more than happy to answer questions sort of after the fact. I love this slide, men wanted hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in case of success. Now, who here would put up their hand to do that? Anyone? Probably not. That may appeal to some people. And again, amalgamated a bit of another slide, and this is around kind of charity, but I have, and this has been exaggerated a little, but not exaggerated much in terms of some of the ads that I've seen for volunteering. We're desperate for volunteers. We're a charity that helps poor people. We need you to come and help us with a really boring fundraiser. You must commit to volunteering 8 hours per week without a break. Please obey all our regulations. Send your application and resume to our CEO, and we'll eventually let you know if we want you. Is anyone going to apply for that volunteer role either? Exactly. So, really, and we could break this down, and unfortunately we don't have too much time to break it down line by line, but, there's things in the title, the heading is not particularly catching. There's not really a clear commitment, or there's too large a commitment being asked. We're not telling you what time frame we're going to get back to you. So all of those things are a real demotivator and provide more barriers. And, again, we could go far more into inclusion, but, stating up front on volunteer advertisement around inclusion and, accessibility requirements, so people don't have to ask the questions. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted in this room around, sharing that information up front, so, that it doesn't become an unconscious barrier. So, I guess I wanted to amalgamate a whole bunch of kind of tips and tricks, and again, I haven't really had time to go in depth through all of these, so I'm aware that this is a little bit of a taster, but Volunteering Victoria has a heap of resources on our website around how to effectively manage and recruit volunteers. We've got a heap of tip sheets around returning volunteers post-COVID, so I'd encourage you to have a look at those guides, and I'm happy to send Laura a bunch of links after this that she can send out to everyone. But in terms of top tips, because I could just leave it with 3, think about it, whether it's possible to make, club events, more family friendly. So often we do have challenges around child safety, and a lot of clubs' answers is to just say, right, we're going to have no children or no people under a particular age. If it's possible to make it more family friendly, that will remove, again, a barrier that some people face in terms of those family commitments. Tap into interests and passions in your advertising material, and really have to be as specific as you can be to set correct expectations and tap into what is likely to motivate people to volunteer. Make it easy for people to register and be really clear what you have to do, and that's right from the spectrum of attracting completely new volunteers to your club, but also in terms of making it really clear what an existing club player needs to do to become a volunteer coach or to become a volunteer umpire. Don't, make them chase around the paperwork. Have a really simple system. Establish procedures for registering volunteers and maintaining accurate records. And accurate records are not just a bugbear, they really help with your recognition and retention of volunteers, being able to recognise birthdays, volunteering anniversaries can go a long way, and people feel they're supported and connected to the club, and social connectedness is a biggie in terms of those motivators. Think about how you carry out induction training and safety briefings, and make sure that the volunteering role is meaningful. And that can, how that looks can vary, but I think understanding that not everyone is going to get super excited in packing down sports equipment, or not everyone is going to be super excited about attending board meetings once a month, but showing them or making sure that it's you have a way to convey the impact of people's volunteering goes a long way in both keeping existing people you have, but giving people such a satisfying experience that they're telling their family and their friends. Now, something like 64% of volunteers are recruited by word of mouth, and I think it goes back to that statistic around never been asked. We're obviously asking a lot of the same people, but word of mouth is one of your most effective recruitment tools. Again, think about how you can support volunteers with a supervisor, contact support person, knowledge and contribution, and kind of making sure the volunteering experience is fun. Just one quick thought to leave you with. So I've quoted figures from our State of Volunteering report, but the other place that we get a lot of information about volunteering is through the General Social Survey, ABS. And in 2010, the census said that there were about 2.3 million volunteers across Australia involved in sport and recreation. And the General Social Survey, basically revealed that the most common type of volunteering in Australia was sport and physical recreation. So you guys have a lot of power and you keep our communities connected and engaged, and diverse and wonderful places to be. And you give at an incredible rate. Sporting organisations have the highest hours of volunteer involvement at sort of 157.5 million hours per year. So when you consider that in terms of value to the economy, and the State of Volunteering report does go into some of those value figures, sport and rec really does contribute incredibly to Victoria, to Australia, and I'm saying this to you guys, and you know better than me, without volunteers there would be no sport in Australia at any level. So I'm going to cut it off there because I'm well aware I might have gone. No?
Doing fine.
Okay. But that is my last slide. So I guess I will open it up to any questions anyone has about anything volunteering related. And sorry, I have been hyper aware at the time, so I've sped through maybe a little too fast.
Sarah, the slide that you had just previously with the top tips, what do you think out of those tips sort of has the most impact on an organisation recruiting and keeping volunteers?
So that one around advertising and how you're talking about volunteer roles, which is why I did talk about the advertising in general in a little bit more detail. I think those of us who are involved in volunteering know what we get out of it, but sometimes we're so ingrained in the nitty-gritty and the doing that we don't actually articulate that very well. And we're going through a similar conversation with environmental volunteering at the moment. People are like, but of course we want to, preserve this patch of land, and the articulation to the greater social impact isn't necessarily made as clearly as it could be. As well as, obviously, word of mouth being an incredibly important recruitment tool, but also thinking about who you're recruiting and targeting messages to them. And so if you're looking at involving parents who are involved in your sporting club a bit more, think about the messaging that you're giving them, but also think beyond your traditional target groups, because I think so often in volunteering we make the mistake of only asking people in our immediate spheres, and there can be great benefit. There are so many great ways to advertise for volunteers online now, through Go Volunteer, Seek Volunteer, through a whole range of organisations, and you can breathe new life into some of your volunteer teams, and you never know who you might attract. And again, it comes down to building those arguments about what the volunteer will get in terms of benefiting. I use this story all the time, but my partner writes grants for an organisation as a volunteer, and when he first told me he was doing that, I was like, really? You want to write grants? But there was a benefit to him in terms of work experience, in terms of a whole bunch of stuff. He cared about the organisation, and it was a way for him to volunteer flexibly. So you never know unless you're asking. And a lot of those portals are super easy to use, and I would just encourage you to think outside the box, because I think often volunteering you can think, oh God, I'm just asking the same people at the same time to do all the same things, and I just feel dreadful doing that. But sometimes all it takes is an injection or thinking about a slightly more diverse group of people that you can tap into, and being able to frame it in the right way, you can unlock a whole lot of enthusiasm. But I guess the other thing I would really keep in mind is don't get too hard on yourselves. Every sector of, every sector in the volunteering space is having trouble re-engaging volunteers. So, this is a shared problem. And, targeting your recruitment will help, but know that everybody is going through this re-emerging after COVID challenge of re-engaging individuals. Any Questions? Comments? Does that reflect your...
I'd like to ask a question in the reverse direction.
Yes?
In our organisation, about 80 or 85% of our people volunteer. We do that by only doing 2 of those things you put up. We do it all just by talking to people. We don't formalise it or anything. But then the problem arises, you regularly finish up with somebody in a role that they can't do. How do you de-volunteer? Without causing problems in the organisation.
So that is a great question, and a lot of organisations get into trouble in exactly that way. And I think it's quite a unique thing about the sporting sector, in that a lot of it is so informal and so much about, connections within community, that people are recruited formally. And I guess my advice when I've had to de-volunteer, use your technical term, is that it's so much easier to have those challenging conversations with someone if you have some infrastructure and some policies and procedures to draw on. And mostly that for me comes back to a position description. And so having a written kind of contract of expectations that you can point back to and say, hey, this is what the position is required, and this is, and it may be to do with attitude or values, it might be due to a technical skill set, but unless you've had that conversation around expectations, you can, exactly as you said, land in a situation where you have people who are kind of out of their depth, or, need to be switched to a volunteer role, and having a conversation around a position description policy makes it a much safer space. And you might find that once you have that conversation with that volunteer, they know that there may be not meeting expectations, or they're feeling a little out of their depth, and they would actually prefer to do something else. But I think it's about unpacking what the role is that's actually required, having some infrastructure to talk to that's a bit of a safe space, so it's less personal, and then I guess being able to identify what the piece of work is and how. So without total specifics, like whether it's a financial, like a treasurer or a board member, like you might actually need to bring in someone who has a bit more financial savvy or experience. But unless you have it written down what's expected, it's really, really hard to have those conversations. And then we can go into formal counselling, informal volunteer performance counselling, and there are a whole range of resources from Justice Connect, the not-for-profit law centre, who talk about the legislative requirements. But I think if there were more formal documents, and I know that goes against the culture in sporting clubs sometimes, and so I apologise if this is a bit of a volunteering risk-averse answer, but I also think you can introduce some formalisation without it changing the culture, because, quite frankly, I think culture can deal with a little bit of bureaucratic process. Part of that is how you relate to one another, part of it is how you kind of operate. But knowing why you're introducing the documents and saying we're doing this volunteer policy, we're writing down the expectations of these board positions or these coaching positions, and it's so that we can not have nasty fallouts with our volunteers or challenges at a committee level. I think you'll find people will be more okay to accept that if you kind of understand the reasoning. I mean, I'm assuming you've been around for a little while. I remember being involved in a very small volunteer organisation when working with children's chefs were introduced. Does anyone remember the conversations around that? It was a real change management process, and people were like, why do we have to do this? We've been, but I found the most effective, kind of method of bringing people on that journey was going back to the reasons why it was being introduced. And yes, there were processes and half, and trying to find ways to make the paperwork better was important, but ultimately it comes down to you bringing the position descriptions to make it easier. I'm happy to have a further talk offline as well. And look, changing culture is hard. large corporations struggle with it on a regular basis, as do volunteer organisations. And again, I think sometimes having a degree of formalisation can be really, really helpful.
Put your hands together for Sarah.
Probably do need to get going, but I did want to, as well as, so my email is on those slides that Laura
And
will
the
be
slides
able
will
to.
be available in Triple Play to download, so we can share that information with anyone that wants to connect with Sarah offline or at a stage.
But also Volunteering Victoria are really keen to connect more with Sport and Rec Victoria, and as I mentioned, it's a slight mismatch that we don't have a lot of membership from sporting organisations. So we're really, really keen to talk. We've just done a submission to a Sport and Rec Victoria inquiry, and Jenna, my colleague here, is also happy to be emailed. Her email is JENNA, and then it's the same as mine. She's really happy to talk about any issues or concerns or challenges you guys are having that you feel it would be great for our peak body to start raising at a statewide level. We talk to ministers all the time, with parliamentary secretary, carers and volunteers, and we've been talking a bit to the sport and recreation minister as well. So we're really always happy to chat, and I'll send Jenna's contact details as well as a few of those guides and resource links to Laura.
Great.
So thank you guys for having me, and sorry for the speed talk.
So next speaker we have is Lauren Metum. She's the Project Officer of Health Promotions for Big Health, and she's going to be discussing with us best practice for grants. Welcome, Lauren.
Big Health, the health promotion operations team. We primarily do grants and community school grants. But firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, or the coordination and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So who Big Health are, I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but so we're a health promotion organisation. It's been around since 1987. We're funded by the tobacco tax to kind of do health promotion activities to serve all Victorians. And we mostly work at the primary prevention end of the spectrum to promote good health and well-being in a number of different kind of areas that address the determinants of health, so often we're looking at health equity as well. We have 5 kind of priority areas in alcohol, healthy eating, mental well-being, tobacco, and physical activity, which will be the focus of this. And we're always looking to kind of find ways of intervening and promote health and well-being in different areas. And one of those areas is definitely kind of in the sporting sector and clubs and at a larger level as well. And one of our main ways of doing that is through grants and funding other organisations to do the great work. So I thought kind of a good place to start in understanding the best practice is to know what we do on our end and how we kind of assess the grants in the process. So we kind of come up with the idea and get the intentions set of what's the priority group going to be, what's the theme going to be. And more recently we've kind of broadened that out to include social connection and healthy eating as well. I'm sure lots of you remember Active Club grants, but now more recently it's been Reimagining Health grants. So there is a possibility of kind of coming in with a social connection angle or a healthy eating angle from a club perspective. It doesn't always have to be physical activity, even though that might kind of be your main sporting approach. So yeah, thinking of the idea and then coming into our stakeholder portal to submit the idea. And then our kind of first step is, what we do is we go through and make sure you filled out all the fields, and then we import it into our system, and then we do an account check to make sure you're an eligible organisation. We get a lot of people that spend a lot of the time doing these grant applications, and they have kind of missed the mark and missed the funding criteria. So we want to make sure that you're giving yourself the best chance to get funded.
That's great.
So we do an account check. What we're doing is we're checking your ABN, we're checking an incorporated organisation, or are you a complement guarantee, or kind of technical terms. So happy to answer those at that stage as well. And then we do an eligibility check. So we want to see, does your idea you're requesting align with the theme? So if that's physical activity and sport kind of idea, is that really clearly reflected? And then the second check is the priority group one that we've pulled out that we want to fund. And then the third kind of eligibility check would be, are the funded items you've requested eligible or not? Often we get some that are maybe for infrastructure, which would probably be better suited for councils and things like that. So it's just good to know what you're getting yourself into before you start the grant applications, so you give yourself the best chance to get funded. After that, we do an address check, so we just want to make sure that your idea is going to be carried out in Victoria. And then we have harmful industries, which is more relevant for people requesting funding over $35,000. It's just a declaration to say that you won't have any current existing relationships with the tobacco company, etc. And then we go into scoring, so we assess it against a marking criteria that pretty much directly aligns with all the questions we've answered. Health equity is always a really, really strong focus for us. And then we go into a shortlisting phase, and we want good equitable spread. And then it actually goes external to an advisory panel. So that's kind of another way of, we have people from the departments, such as like SRB, sometimes come and attend, and people from peak bodies, and they get to have input as well into making sure it gets funded. And then it goes to the CEO recommendation. I know it's quite an overwhelming long process, but I think the best tips for this is to make sure you're eligible and really, really thoroughly check the grant guidelines. They're always different, and they can change. So if you applied last round or the round before, they might have like slightly switched, or they might have loosened up a little bit. So it's good to just make sure that you're aware of the most current existing grant guidelines. Want to make sure you have the right organisational status, that your project meets the funding body requirements. Just make sure that you're definitely eligible within that. Make sure you're in the right geographic area for the grants. Determine whether you need partners or not. Sometimes that's a requirement for funding bodies. It's not a requirement for us, but it can certainly strengthen your application. You've got the right people who can support the ideas. You need to be able to deliver the project in the required time. So kind of seeing if you've got the resources for it. You also need to consider if you can manage to fit it, and that you're meeting the applicant and criteria. My second step would be to prepare early. So I know for Vic Health we often have it, and some other funding bodies, you can download that application early, and I think this can be really helpful for clubs if they're going to committee meetings and things. You can take the idea, get a bit of input from everyone, and then go away and work off it online. And I think this is a really great way of involving everyone in the process as well. My third tip is to request a realistic funding amount. Sometimes people have wonderful ideas, but perhaps the value for money isn't as strong as the application next to it. And so there's two side by side. The one with a stronger value for money often might score a little bit higher, and it's built into our criteria specifically. So I think part of that is really nutting up the budget that you put out there, so that you know that you've kind of itemized the funding box and consider who you can collaborate with, whether that's contacting your SSAs, RSAs, or the councils. Specific organisations might have a better connection to certain priority groups, and that could be really strengthen your applications as well. The fifth tip would be to consider the long-term impact of your project. So we want to support ideas that can have continued long-term impact. So often if it's got like an educational element, or if it's like training people up and upskilling people, they tend to be really strong ones alongside kind of an initiative at the same time. And then the last tip is to involve your community and co-design it. The best application is the one where apply for. So the kind of rationale here is we will be able to increase the connection and decrease social isolation for regional and rural LGBTQI+ young people through this basketball yoga mindfulness program. So I think that's a really great example of maybe a lower funding tier kind of one. And then the second one is for a bit larger, so it's 500+ participants with culturally and linguistically diversity. And they've kind of itemized out the reasoning, maybe it's like low socioeconomic, residing in inactive or underserved area. There's going to be a spread of genders. And it kind of says why participants will benefit in this one. So they're people who have experience with swimming, and this is a grant where they're applying to teach poor refugees how to swim. And the funded items, so this is kind of carrying on from this. So when you're applying for your funding request, we'll often ask you to explain what you're actually applying for funding with. And you have to complete a budget template. These are really simple, but it's helpful to just kind of itemize it out and break it up rather than just like operational costs with it. What are those things? So for example, one, they're saying we've got weekly basketball and mindfulness programs. It's going to be virtual in person, led by LGBTQI+ professionals. And they're going to do one workshop each week over a 6-month period. And then they've kind of listed out the activities, so it's yoga, training, and then transgender, diverse, informed mental coaching. And then there's a budget, so they're kind of broken it down with project manager, digital accessibility, workshop facilitators, and event promotion costs. So I think that's really clear. We can see where the funding is going with that one. And it kind of gives you a bit of confidence that they'll be able to quit and deliver on this. So for the second one, it's a little bit more fleshed out as well because it's a bigger project. So it's 2 times 8-week swimming programs over a 6-month period. So really large reach of 500 people. And there's kind of 2 elements to it. Some are culturally and linguistically diverse, and others more specialised program for teaching people to swim who may have disability. And so they've broken out these activities as beach recreation programs, a learn to swim thing, and then a training role model development course. So it's kind of got multiple levels to it, which I think adds to it being a good application. And they've kind of broken down the costs again a bit more specifically. There's going to be 3 coaches, promotional activities, and all that as well. So I just think just contrast it with one that wouldn't be as strong. Sometimes people just say what they're doing and maybe not itemize it. And I think it's just helpful to be able to kind of see it a little bit more clearly translated. So my final thing would just be to make sure you educate yourself on all your funding opportunities and note them down. We're just one of many. There's Swanborough Victoria, Big Sport, Clearinghouse, Good Sports Community, and local governments. I'm sure they have this all on their website as well. So definitely encourage you to register and make a note of it and plan for it with your clubs. Thank you.
Were there any questions for Lauren? Stand back.
clubs, SSAs, non-for-profits are allowed. We do auspicing now in the last year, which we haven't previously done for a long time, I think. So that's kind of helpful to know if you're not exactly an auspice if you're not an organisation that would be eligible. Definitely make sure you can kind of create that partnership so you can be eligible. Because I think, and I'm happy to help if you're not sure if you're eligible or not.
Well, it's just worth asking the questions. I know the last 5 years trying to get assistance has been very difficult.
Yeah.
And we've sort of built everything on our back, so if something's changed at the time when assistance can be provided, something that needs to be sure to provide great resources to our staff and also to the children that we're after.
Yeah, I think the intention, we're launching a new funding round in September, which I don't know if I can speak too much to, but one will be small grants and one will be medium grants, with a lot larger funding chances basically, a lot higher than it previously has been. So I think there's going to be a bit of like a workshop to explain the new kind of criteria for that. So yeah, making sure you're registered for those sorts of things so that you get the information early. I think it'd be really helpful.
Lauren, is there a way that people can contact or can, like if they're going for a Vic House grant, is there someone that they can call up and talk about their eligibility and talk about their idea and that kind of thing to discuss those options?
Yeah, I think we can definitely do it leading up early, I think, but like if it's a few days before, it gets really tricky to reply to them because we have thousands of applications. But the best email I can provide you would be the partnership grants at vichealth.vic.gov.au, because there's always someone monitoring that inbox. And we can also give you a number if that's helpful.
Were there any other questions?
I noticed in those two examples you gave, you had what the exercise was about. Then you put down from the organisation what they're going to do, like organise yoga, and then the cost. Do you need to put in things which talk about why yoga is the best thing to have rather than plain others? Or, you know what I'm trying to say? What are the benefits of the thing? Or do you simply rely upon putting down what the benefit, because it must line up with yours?
Yeah, I kind of picked out two rather than all of them. So there's some that kind of ask a bit more like, what would the impact? There's a question actually about what is the impact. So part of that question is what is the reach? So how many people benefit? But also like why is that program good? And so that would kind of be maybe an area where you could say yoga is positive for this. I think for small grants, it's not as necessary to, regurgitate that sort of information. I also think those are really like fleshed out examples. Like you don't necessarily have to write the activity as long as it's in one of the description. There's like a few kind of boxes you end up putting it in. But I think it never hurts to kind of demonstrate why it's a good thing.
When's the general time of year for grants? I know there's always been a couple of pools that happen.
Yeah, we do ours twice a year.
Yeah.
They kind of want to increase it, but it's basically tons of build up at the start and lots of processing at the end. But ours are March and September, typically.
Yeah. So the next bout is September. Yeah.
I think September.
Can I ask you one more?
Yeah.
If you get one, does that rule you out the next time?
Currently, that is the most recent rule has been it has to be a new idea. So what we did is we had to pull up last rounds and this round and then go through them and be like, no, this is enough of a variation. For instance, one was an expansion into a new area they'd never gone in a regional kind of area. So we felt that was significantly different because it was a new kind of cohort area. But if you're getting funding for the exact same thing and kind of repeating it, we can't do that. Yeah.
Is that just for example, would that be
think a lot of, so that's specific to Vic Health, that kind of rule. And that one might shift sometimes, but currently I think that'll be, because we want to kind of share the funding around.
Because I know with council, once you get any form of bank restricted your funds and that's it, you can't.
Generally, yeah.
So, I know previously for the active club grants, which are kind of done now, it was 2 years you're ineligible. So it changes from organisation to organisation. So it's good to kind of like make note.
But must the body that's going to get the grant be financially viable?
Pardon?
Or must the body that the people applying for the grant, you know, I know a lot of us apply for grants who are just broke and are never going to survive out of it. It's really wasting taxpayers' money. Do you do any checks as to whether the organisation who's seeking the grant is a financially viable organisation?
We don't have the capacity to do that sort of thing. Hopefully by the time we're kind of looking at the application, you get an idea. And that's part of that requesting realistic funding, like organisations that maybe aren't that organised will request kind of much more than I think is necessary. But we do an audit, so we kind of pick a random selection of grant recipients and they have to be able to prove that they've acquitted all the funds. Yeah.
My organisation is extremely busy and very viable for grants, but we're struggling from building back code. And I get all these applications, I'm grant writer, but of course it's so difficult because I have to, I guess what I'm asking, is there any volunteers for grant writers? Is there anything? Because again, we're marrying into this volunteer thing, we're marrying into grants. I wish I had time to sit down and go through a fee and do all the grants that I can. But quite often all our organisations that are on the ground setting up, doing the grassroots, we don't have the time to get to it. And then, oh, we missed it. Now we're on to September again.
Yeah.
So is there anybody that we can access that will be able to help us with a volunteer, somebody that would be able to volunteer, you know, writing grants?
Yeah, we don't exclude people for using grant writers.
I know.
Yeah. I don't know about volunteers specifically. I could recommend, sorry. But, yeah. I know, like, we don't not allow grant writers. I think they take about 5% of the.
30 actually is most
okay.
Yeah, and that's paid up front, and that's no guarantee you can get the grant. So that's where the difficulty lies. So if you grant writer, they're requesting 30% of grants that they're applying for to be paid up front. Yes. To be paid up front.
Somewhere between.
Oh,
In fact, taking that further, can you put the cost of the grant rather than use grants?
that's
Grant plus
where
10%.
We haven't said it's not allowed to be at the moment, but it's probably for something.
that's where the big companies like yours are saying about these organisations that get grant after grant after grant after grant, and here we are, the struggling ones that don't, because they've got one grant writer that tees it up every single time and gets paid, and that's their one job. They landed a grant writer 2 years ago, and that's all he's doing to track it down. So there needs to be that assistance, because the gentleman's right. There are clubs and organisations that have got so much wiggle with grants, and now it's been pivoted away.
Well, local government area, I have about 4 local governments. So most local governments would also have a grant writer that would be able to support, assist you for a community organisation to assist you in writing your grant.
A lot of supporting big bodies do too.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. SSA councils for sure.
It depends on your local government. So yes, so I'm really young, we don't have a grant writer, but my role is to supporting organisations and local clubs, and I will happily read grant applications and to support them in what wording it has to align with guidelines, with whether it's a sport and rec or a food health. That's what I'm making. We've got just grants, but there should be someone in your local government that will be able to assist you.
Can I move to your area?
No, there is one where I'm visiting
we receive from the sporting club, so internal grant applications for our community wellness and community wellbeing grants, is that one grant writer might write for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then copy and paste in the same grant application. So we're very, very mindful of what services you're receiving from that grant writer as well, because we see them all when I see them and I go, well, actually, we can deliver that for that sporting club, for that group, rather than having a grant writer write it.
Yeah, I was actually wanting to get to that and say the negative aspect of grant writers, because I don't want to say they're positive or negative or neutral. But that's a huge issue, is sometimes they literally just copy and paste an idea, and when we're looking at them, it's really hard to justify funding because it doesn't have like a unique point of view. So I can understand like the time it has to be writing it. It's really tricky though.
Just duplicate yourself.
I'm seriously, it's what everyone says, Laura.
Did anyone else have any other questions for Lauren? All right, thank you very much. I feel like Mel has already introduced herself here. Dixon, who's going to talk about member retention, unfortunately couldn't make it from last year's COVID challenges. Dixon, who's going to talk about member retention, unfortunately couldn't make it from last year's COVID challenges. But that's okay because we had both Tom and Mel talking to member retention, so we still get to cover best practice for member retention.
Thank you, Laura. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the elders past, present and emerging. As Laura said, I know a few faces in the room today, but also happy to see some different faces. And I know we've got representation from a variety of the sector. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a show of hands. Who here is from a regional sports assembly? Beautiful, beautiful. Who's from local government? Local clubs, state sporting associations, and other peak bodies. Fantastic. We've got a great representation here today. And obviously being from local government, obviously we are not just roads, rates and rubbish. So most people think that's all we do. We do way more than that. So my role is sports development. I've been in local government for a long time, 15 years. And at 2 different councils, and previous to that I was at a regional sports assembly, so I have been around the sector just a little bit these days. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about local government, a little bit about member retention, but also we can look at some of the conversations that have already happened today in regards to grants, in regards to volunteering, and then what the impact of that and what local government can actually do to support you as your individual bodies as well. Just beautiful. So I'm from Kidinia Shire Council, so Kidinia with a C and not a K. So I'm not from down Geelong way. I was born and bred in Geelong, so a lot of people get a little bit confused about that. We are one of 79 local government associations or authorities, and we're 55k from the CBD. So the good thing about us is we're still metro, but we're actually still rural and have a regional element as well. So when lockdowns happen, our residents love us because we have a little bit of both, but they are considered as metro. We're an interface council, so that's what that means. We're on the border of metro, but also rural areas. Most wouldn't be surprised, but it's one of the things that I actually really like talking about is local governments are the biggest sponsor of community sport. So we may not hand you over the dollars in your back pocket. We build our facilities for the community and for sport to take place in, as well as not just structured sport, but participation sport as well. We have a responsibility to our community under our health and wellbeing plans. So each local government has what we call a municipal health and wellbeing plan. They're a legislative document. So we have a council plan, municipal health and wellbeing plan, and then there's hundreds of other plans and policies as well, including sports development, participation, facility standards, state park strategies, bikes and trails, whatever policy and plan, you'll probably usually find that on a council page. But I wanted to highlight the health and wellbeing plan because this is where it all culminates all together around our responsibility to our community, whether that's in health, whether that's in inclusion and participation, whether that's in sport, but it forms a big part of why local government operate as well, not just roads, rates and rubbish. So this is just a little bit of a snapshot. This is Covinia's livability plan, and most local governments at the moment are going through their livability or their municipal health and wellbeing plan refresh. So this is where we take into consideration all our different cohorts, all our different responsibilities to community, and this is Covinia's. So, and this is based on data evidence, both internal, external, state government data, about what we know about our communities, their socio-demographics, around our education, our active travel, and things like that. So each of the things that we do within a local government sector fits into one of these things. So I can justify that when I do club development training, that it fits into improving mental health and wellbeing, social cohesion, community safety, reduces obesity. So most of the things that I do actually fit in each of those segments or those areas of our vision. I just wanted to use this one as well because this actually shows, and some people have seen this before because I've actually used this before. Within the role that I partake, I sit within a sport and leisure team or active resilience and leisure facilities we're currently named. And these are all the different things that we actually do. So we don't just provide the facilities, we actually look at how we work with our community within those facilities. And whether that's around inclusion, participation, whether that's around supporting volunteers, it is around facility allocation and facility development. I'm lucky, I don't do that part. I don't do anything with facilities, which is fantastic. I get to do the proactive side where I get to work with the people within the facilities. We also deliver, I know there's been some conversations around grants, but projects, programs, services, and monitor and report the outcomes as well. We too apply for grants through state bodies to build our facilities. Obviously, ratepayers don't pay for the entirety of the multi-million-dollar facilities that are being built. So we do advocate and liaise with bodies like Sport and Rec Victoria and the state and federal government as well. I like to use this as a little bit of a framework for my role. Essentially, I do community development within a sports setting. I use sport, physical activity and participation to connect with community, to deliver health outcomes and to make people feel social and emotional, connected to where they live, work and play. I also do obviously the sport development, so developing the sport that takes place, working with our community volunteers, such as people in this room, working with our state sporting associations and insisting them to deliver what they need to deliver to get their outcomes through their participation grant funding and through the outcomes of targeting specific cohorts in participation. As I mentioned, I do specific club development, so working based on the needs of what our clubs require. And recently we held a Women in Sport Forum, which was greatly attended. I know Caitlin attended as well, which was wonderful. And different topics, similarly to what a regional sports assembly would deliver as well. I deliver in a metro-based setting. And obviously we use sport for development. So in those spaces and places where we might be looking at social isolation or disconnection or crime, we actually use sport as the tool to bring people together to then actually engage and participate and connect them to different services as well. I created this slide a little while ago, or this capture. These are all the different organisations and partnerships that I work within, both you can see they're duplicated a little bit to make it really colourful. But without partnerships, I wouldn't be able to do my role. So most people aren't actually aware that Covinia probably fund my role more so than a budget. I have $15,000 to do anything and everything that I do, from club development workshops to participation programs So everything I do is in partnership, which is why I know quite a few faces around the room as well. And that's how I connect, because we have delivery outcomes that we can deliver at a local level area. So sometimes I keep looking at the state sporting associations at the back, knowing how they're differently funded and how they actually get out to each local government area, or how they deliver with their clubs or support their clubs as well. So I act as an on-the-ground person. So we're coming into, obviously, member retention and volunteer retention, and this topic could be a whole day-long event, and we can break it all up and we can have all these different conversations about how, where, why, what. But just as I mentioned, we deliver workshops with the sporting clubs. There are a number of other councils that directly deliver workshops, and I know the regional sports assemblies also deliver sessions to their clubs and community groups as well. So when we do this, we do it based on the needs of our sporting clubs. So I'll send out a survey to the community clubs and say, what's your priority area? And they will respond sometimes. And I will then plan the workshops. And recently during COVID, we did exactly the same, but we bought everything online. So when I asked all the sporting clubs what they would like, I was very pleasantly surprised that they responded and said mental health was their number one priority. And that's pretty great of our clubs to actually come forward. So what I did then is then went and worked with Richmond Institute, who are a subsidiary of Richmond Football Club. We have a partnership with Richmond Football Club out at Cardinia. They run mental health first aid. We actually offered it to our sporting club volunteers at a very reduced price of $55 instead of $210 per person, and then connected those individuals who had been through that workshop with our Monash Health Healthy Sports Club program. So they then received additional support, continuation support of how they actually implement mental health programs and processes within their club. We also then worked with our local level services, so your Headspaces, your URBAs, to connect into that program as well. So when people are returning from sport, or when we're all socially isolated, those clubs have the skills and capacity, or the volunteers I should say, to then work with, you know, the different families within their sporting clubs. So that was something that council provided to our sporting clubs. So that's some of the things that we can do, again with that local level need and understanding our own demographic. And often when sporting clubs say, we can't get volunteers, we can't get members, one of the key areas that we then support them in is, do you understand your local demographic? So profile ID, it's one thing that you're not aware of, but profile ID, if you jump on that website, you can look at your local government area, and it's statistics that will break down each area that will say what is the socioeconomic status, what is the cultural makeup, what is the education level. So we teach and encourage clubs to learn about their actual direct, I guess, surroundings within a kilometre limit, and then how to specifically target those groups or look at those programs rather than just the age of, let's do a letterbox drop and just see who shows up. So teaching clubs about their own demographics is one thing that council can support as well. We've heard volunteer challenges in clubs, and did anyone want to sort of mention, I'm going to do an activity after I am going to make you actually stand up and do an activity. Did anyone want to mention something that might be going in their club or their sport or their area, your biggest volunteer challenge at the moment?
Referees.
Sorry?
Referees.
Referees.
State body and local.
Yep, referees, and anecdotally, we've definitely heard at the moment that referees umpiring is one of the hardest hit in terms of volunteers. And some of that might be that people have found something else to do. People have decided that, you know what, I don't want to turn up to that game each week and get abused, potentially, because we do know that there's negative sideline behaviour in sport that we're all trying to stamp out. So yeah, referees. Anyone else from a club?
Senior players.
Players? Yeah,
Players
definitely.
and
Yeah.
I don't know whether you can call them volunteers, but definitely jumped on.
Yeah, definitely players. So this is something that anecdotally, there's lots of evidence out there at the moment, but anecdotally from a local level of delivery, we're aware of that from a council perspective. Different sports, different age cohorts have actually not returned in the same way. We've had clubs come to us and say, where there's obviously programs for women and girls and participation, and it's a key area that is funded, but at the moment, those girls still aren't returning based on ones that were already playing, not based on work, not based on the things that we're already aware of, but based on the anxiety coming back to sport participation. So we know that we need to do a little bit of work in that. And that's where our cross-council delivery really is key. So when a state sporting association, when a club comes to us and says, we really want to target this group, or we understand our demographic now, we know that we've actually got quite a few of this cultural group, or we've got individuals with a disability, because we work internally with a whole lot of different council officers that actually work with specific groups from a sport and rec perspective. I can actually have those internal conversations. So we've got from pretty much a council officer that works with every single one of those demographic diversity areas. So if your club came to me, or if one of our clubs came to me and said, we really want to do, we want to engage more older adults, we're aware we've got our COVID safe practices in place, what can we do? We want to do walking football, or we want to do some of those programs that the state bodies have been funded for through the social programs. Then I would work with either the club, the individual, the state sporting association, but also cross-council with our key people that are already working in that field. So that community development process would enable you to assist in connecting through that. Does that make sense? Beautiful. And again, because of the networks and the relationships that I'm paid to, I can then connect more broadly with different organisations. I know I'm working across different sports where I go, have you considered working with this sport? And that's a foreign thing for a lot of state sporting associations when they're not sure if they can actually work together. But when we're targeting women and girls, the classic example, and I know I keep looking down at you, but the classic example is working with Football Victoria's Go Girls program and targeting 12 to 15-year-old girls as is the cross at the moment. So how can we marry that up at the same time and create a program together that still meets the needs of each of their funding requirements, but targets our local cohorts as well? Because not every girl at that age wants to participate in that particular sport. So how can we diversify and do that multi-sport program? So that's where local government can bring in connections and relationships as well.
Just a question, on our clubs in Hume City Council, so there's a person with you in the Hume City Council?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So-
you come to club meetings?
Yeah. Yeah, so if a club asks me and says we need some help, and I help from everything from supporting how to write a strategic plan, how to write a grant, right down to let's look at a participation program, let's look at how to build volunteers, let's look at, I'm attending a club meeting tomorrow because they've said we need an emergency meeting, we can't get volunteers, we're all going to fall apart and this is going to happen. So I turn up to that meeting and have a bit of a conversation and help them around strategies or how to link into things. Doesn't mean I've got a pocket full of volunteers that will suddenly come and run that club, but they can use council for that support as well. Most local governments will have someone to connect to, whether it's a standalone sport development role or it's within their sport and leisure department, there will be someone. We also have a local government inclusion network as well, which is made up of quite a few local governments, Vic Health, SRB, Vic Sport, Laura sits on it, so other Proud to Play sit on it, CMY, Disability Sport and Rec also sit on it. So again, connecting through those networks, that if it's not convenient, there might be someone else or through other local governments. Yes?
How do we go about finding the equivalent of you at our local council? Just a matter of calling the council and asking for.
What a beautiful question. Yes. We understand that it's quite hard to navigate metro of who to find in local government. I think regional sports assemblies have a really positive connection with their community, that most sports will go to a regional sports assembly probably before they go to their local government. So I'll probably offer it up that if anyone is looking for someone in a local government, nearly know someone at least every local government that I can connect you with or point you in the right direction. So a little bit about the member retention and volunteering. Look, I understand Tom was going to take everyone through probably all the stats, the specific programming. And as I mentioned, I actually wanted to do it from a local level delivery. So often one of the challenges that clubs make is when these grants come up, and sorry, block your ears, I know, we're looking for new ideas and we're looking for new things that can happen and we're looking for what we can do differently. Sometimes it's going back to basics. So it's actually looking at, well, are we trying to attract new members or are we trying to understand why our members are leaving? So really looking at that retention focus as well. And I think clubs get caught up in, we just need you. So what often happens is Jackie doesn't return to the club, they don't sign up for the next year, and the club goes, oh well, there's no process in following up why and how, or that exit interview or exit survey. And if that was to happen, I think those individuals that weren't coming back feel that there's a little bit of a personal connection. Yes, that's another volunteer role, and that is something that someone has to do, but it is about understanding why your members are there or why they've left. And sometimes they might have had a negative experience, sometimes it could be financial, sometimes it could be just doesn't fit with lifestyle anymore. So clubs really need to get that balance about retention and new, and I think that's one key tip. I think we're focusing on new all the time because we're looking at different demographics. I know you're shaking your head. Did you want to comment on that one?
We found one going all our members with that. And by talking to them, we got about 35 to 40% on that.
Beautiful, because they probably felt connected back to the club. There's probably a reason they might not have felt connected. And I think during COVID as well, that different isolation or social isolation. You know, do I come back? Don't I? Who's going to be there when I come back? Am I going to be asked to do a role that I'm not ready to do? So I think it's really important, yes, knowing and understanding your members.
We have two people who look after, or about 8 who look after new members from that community. But we have about 10 people whose job it is to find out why people left and get back.
That's a beautiful model. Maybe people can chat to you afterwards and find out how you implemented that as well. I think, I know at Kittinia, one of the award nominees next week for the Victorian Sport Awards is a Kittinia volunteer, and of course we're very proud of that. And I know during COVID, this volunteer actually kept in contact, remembered all their members' birthdays, it's a netball club, and called everyone on their birthdays and checked in. Now, that's a big task, as we could understand, but it actually helped with that reconnection, particularly of that female cohort in coming back to the club. And then link them in with some mental health support. And this volunteer has come to me and said, oh, I'm really struggling in the 14, 15-year-old girls. They're quite apprehensive, they've got a bit of anxiety because of the programs I already do and the things that I'm connected to. I've actually now connected them directly to Headspace with an email, an e-interaction email. So I come back to that partnerships and collaboration. That's really, really important. In terms of what we know, I've sort of mentioned this a little bit, but what we know around COVID, people have found different things to do or have different priorities, and unfortunately, physical activity or participation in structured sport may not be the priority anymore. So everyone is aware that when COVID hit, you had your 5K limit in Metro Melbourne, that couldn't buy a bike anymore. So then council have to look at what infrastructure is and then to allow people to actually ride their bikes safely So people have found different things to do, or things that they can do intergenerationally with their whole family. Not their 8-year-old goes off to Auskick and their 11-year-old girl goes off to potentially a gymnastics or a football or a thing like that. So people have really looked at what's important to them as a family and how can they manage that now. We are aware that there's some financial implications for sport participation. There has been obviously programs to support and address this through Sport and Rec Victoria's Get Active Victoria vouchers, which I'm going to give it a plug, is about to reopen on the 31st of May. So if your club or your state body is out there promoting that, those vouchers will come out again, and they're targeting the lower socioeconomic participation opportunities. So there is that funding to support participation as well for membership fees for equipment and the like. Some cohorts are more anxious to return to participation. I know those potentially with health challenges may find that they're not sure what's going to happen when they walk into the club. Is it COVID safe? Have the club or have the sport done the right thing in return in regards to do they feel safe? Is it clean? And those type of things. As well as Laura has pointed out, some sports have actually dropped off some of their specific programming, if it is around inclusion-based programs or disability-specific programs, that they actually aren't delivering those anymore. So those cohorts are actually missing out on quite a bit of participation opportunities. So that's something that we definitely need to think about from a local level as well. So I know we've got about 15 minutes, and I know you've all been sitting down a lot and everyone else has been talking. So I'm going to ask you, I want you to find someone that you actually don't know and have a little bit of a chat about what's one thing you're doing in your club or organisation to support member retention, different types of programs, discounts, understanding the need of your club and community, and what is one thing that you could implement to support participation to either maintain members or increase members. So what is one thing that from this session that you can walk away, have a conversation with your committee or your sporting organisation about what you could do. And then if we've got time, we'll share that back to the group. But essentially, one of the other things that Pavilion did is we created an Aboriginal and Cold Sport Assistance Program. And because we knew the demographic in regards to participation was lower for Aboriginal and culturally and linguistically diverse participants, interestingly enough, our applications for that, we've had 13. So we need to then go back and knowing it's a cohort that don't participate due to financial barriers. And there was a whole lot of other layers in there as well, where we actually delivered inclusion training to our clubs first to ensure that there was, once that individual walked through the door, they felt welcome, included. There was no racist, misogynistic, homophobic behaviour and things like that. So, but we've had 13 applicants, so we need to revisit why and how. Is it the process that they don't see council as someone that can offer them money? Was the process too hard? Did we not advertise it enough? So again, these are different programs that different councils might implement. And I do know Greenbank have an intersport participation program. Boroondara used to have one, I'm not sure where it is. So most councils will have something that will support participation. So whether they're community wellbeing grants, in the likes of a business, and structured business, there are economic development units that would be able to support you and different business grants, even though you're a sport or you're a participation outcome as well. So if you want to have a little bit of a chat, or if there's any specific questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer.
Stand up, stand up.